welcome back to my book reading of my very first book, Lilly Prospero and the Magic Rabbit. I'm up to chapter 3. I'm JJ Barnes and I'm the author, and I'm reading a chapter of this book every week. When I finished reading it all, I'm going to stitch all the videos together and make one long track. So if you wanted to listen to it as a full audiobook, it will be available. And I'll post links of where you can get a copy of this book if you want to read ahead or read along with me. Yeah, it's out, so you can get it. And yeah, I'll just crack straight on because I'm on to chapter 3. Leaning on a tree, Alex was watching her approach with a teasing smile playing on his lips. Lily felt her breath catch in her throat and wished she had more, or any, experience with boys. Anything that would stop her turning to a puzzle every time Alex looked at her. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand as Lily got close. "Why?" she asked hesitantly. "It's worth it," he said, grinning mischievously. "Can't we talk here?" she asked, nervously looking around. Her mother's lingering rule of not going with strangers was sitting uncomfortably in her belly, although she felt a little silly for heeding the childhood warning. "It's about magic." He leaned forward and whispered in her ear. Holding out his hand again, he nodded earnestly with his eyes full of promise, and Lily allowed herself to be led away. Lily's pulse raced in trepidatious excitement as he took her around the back of the outbuildings, across the fields, and into the wooded area at the back of the grounds. Then he vanished. Lily screamed. She could still feel his hand in hers, but he'd disappeared. Laughing, he reappeared as suddenly as he had gone. "Magic," he said, in a jubilant voice as she stared open-mouthed at him. "See? Told you it was worth it." Lily didn't speak. Her mind had been hit by too big a cloud of wonderment to articulate any words. "I know. You thought you were the only one, right?" Lily nodded mutely. "So weird that your family don't have any power. I guess you're different to them." "A bit," she agreed, though she hadn't really thought about whether they had magic before. She frowned. "Did they?" "I can't imagine what that's like, not being able to escape back to reality after being in this place," he said sympathetically. "So, what can you do?" "You don't know?" she asked. He shook his head. "Things I draw have started coming to life." "That's cool. So what have you drawn?" "Butterflies and bees," she said sheepishly, for the first time feeling like it wasn't actually that impressive. "I guess it's just because you're new to all this," he said thoughtfully, making Lily feel even more inadequate than she already did. "Most people's powers are active from birth, at least in some way. It takes time to learn to control it. When I was little, I turned invisible randomly, and my parents were always losing me. The neighbours were convinced they were haunted because they kept hearing a child crying." He chuckled heartily. "Of course, when I learned to control it, I still used to go and spook them, just for the fun of it. Eventually they moved." "Were they okay?" Lily asked, looking worried. "I guess so. I never asked," he said. Lily looked around and nervous. His tone unsettled her, and she suddenly felt very isolated and vulnerable with the strange boy. Noticing, Alex put a hand on her arm and said reassuringly, "No, it's good, I promise." They were pathetic mortal types. People with power moved in instead. Nobody wants to live next door to mortals. He shuddered at the thought. Lily gulped. "Oh, okay," she said, feeling completely overwhelmed and not convinced at all it was okay. "So, drawing," he said, changing the subject. "You're entering that art competition then?" "Yeah, I am," she said. "Good. You'll do well. I'm certain of it. So, how about tonight you do a bit of practice, then tomorrow I introduce you to a few more people." "People?" "Yeah, our sort. Strong powers." "More?" He laughed again. "Yes, more. Oh, Lily, there's so much you don't know. What a good job I found you so quickly. You'd have been lost without me." Lily realised he was right. She knew nothing. "Look, you need to take this seriously, though," he said, with a stern look on his face that made Lily anxious. "There are some absolute hopeless cases who have powers but don't use them, don't develop them. They're a complete disgrace to the community, to be honest. If you're not going to use your power to its full potential, then you don't deserve to have it. They end up either losing control of their magic and becoming dangerous, like that freak Asya, or just having undeveloped rubbish powers that are no use to anybody, like this guy Billy who changes the colour of things like an absolute loser. Or If they don't use it for long enough, their powers just die. He looked pained at the idea. If I had my way, their powers would be removed and given to someone else who deserves them. Somebody who'd use them properly, you know? Absolutely, she said earnestly. Despite the fact she wasn't sure she liked what he was saying, she was desperate to prove she wasn't one of those people. She deserved her power. She would use her power. They started walking back towards the school. So, tomorrow lunchtime, he said authoritatively. Come and meet some great people, and be ready. I don't want them thinking less of you because you're not very advanced. I understand, but they might not. Lily nodded frantically. She would definitely practice. Turning the corner around the outbuildings, Lily and Alex nearly walked straight into Saffron, who was talking on her phone, her eyes red with tears. She spun around, hung up the phone, and looked in disgust at Lily. Hey, Saffron, said Alex, before winking at Lily and walking away. Lily watched him leave, desperate for him to come back so she didn't have to face Saffron alone. As he disappeared into a crowd of pupils, she turned to look Saffron in the eye. What the hell does Alex Thompson want with you? She spat at Lily. We're just friends, said Lily, shuffling her feet and picking at her thumbnail. Honest. You don't have any friends, she hissed, and stormed away, her long red curls flying behind her. For the rest of the day, Saffron and her friends whispered about Lily and sent her evil stares. But for the most part, she was left alone. Gratefully, she wallowed in solitude. Her mind was racing, too occupied with the new world she was discovering to deal with the old one she was stuck in. She wanted to practice her power and learn more about it. She wanted to impress the people Alex was introducing her to and not make a fool of herself for once. And she wanted to paint something amazing for the competition. But first, she wanted to get through her after-school detention. Mrs. Robinson greeted her sadly. Sorry to see you here. Sorry to be here, said Lily genuinely. Disappointing anyone weighed heavily on her, especially it was one of the few people who actually seemed to like her. I'll be in and out, Mrs. Robinson said, handing her a pad of lined paper. But you can hand your letters to me when you finish at 4:30, okay? Lily agreed and started writing, but was distracted when the door was pushed open and Saffron slunk in, looking miserable. I've got to wait in here again, she said to Mrs. Robinson in a desolate voice, before she noticed Lily was watching her. Oh, Saffron, not again, said Mrs. Robinson, her voice heavy. Okay, pet, take a seat. I'll go and see if I can find out what's happened this time. The teacher stood sadly and stepped out into the corridor, shutting the door. Saffron swung her bag onto the desk with a thump and landed in the chair, resting her chin on her hands and avoiding looking at Lily. For the second time that day, Lily found herself asking her, Are you okay? This time, however, Saffron just shook her head sadly and muttered, Not really. What happened? Stupid au pair forgot to pick me up again. She forgets all the time. She doesn't give a crap. I'm sorry. I could catch a bus, no problem, Saffron said grumpily, but my mum's this total control freak and doesn't want me anywhere she doesn't know at any time. I'm 15. It's ridiculous. I'm sorry, said Lily again. Despite everything, she felt sorry for Saffron. I'm used to it, Saffron said dismissively, then turned to look at Lily properly. So, you're in for letting those freaky little bugs out, right? Yeah, Lily said awkwardly. Saffron laughed. You were crazy! We were all screaming and running for it and you were off to the window ignoring everyone? I bet Mrs. Crank was furious. Yeah, she's a scary lady, Lily agreed emphatically. Total bitch, agreed Saffron, smiling at her. Lily wasn't sure she'd ever seen Saffron genuinely smile before. It was nice. It lit her face up and made her green eyes sparkle. Mrs. Robinson came back in and they fell back into silence. Okay, Saffron, Marika is stuck in Birmingham, the teacher said. Apparently the M6 is snarled up. We're trying to get hold of your mother, but so far no luck. I'm so sorry. Saffron sighed, giving Lily a half smile of dull acceptance. Lily went back to writing her letters, and when 4:30 came, she handed them to Mrs. Robinson and picked up her bag. Hesitating, she turned to Saffron and said, See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, Saffron said, looking at her with kind eyes and a sad smile. Heading down the corridor, preparing to see her mum and explain why she was in detention, Lily heard someone say her name. She spun around and saw the other girl who'd been stood with Ashia the day before, peering at her through dark almond eyes. She was tiny, not more than 5 feet tall, and very slim, but stared with an intensity which was fierce. You can't trust Alex. What? He's dangerous. They are dangerous. Her voice was quiet, but carried such ardour that Lily felt every word resonate inside her. You need to stay away from them. Lily took a step backwards, unsettled by the intense girl in front of her. I don't know what you mean. You are going to hurt so many people, she suddenly cried out, the stillness falling away and a wild look taking over her face. You don't know me, protested Lily, stepping back again, shaking her head and feeling sick. I know you are going to be responsible for death, she said, as tears started to creep down her cheeks. Her eyes were fixed on Lily, and she looked in physical pain. Leave me alone, Lily cried, then turned and ran. From behind her, she heard the girl call out, Drop out of the competition, Lily! Breathing fast, she rushed out of the school, wishing she could get straight home to talk to Geoffrey, needing the words of someone familiar with the magical world she had been suddenly thrust into. As she approached the school gates, wishing she could just escape, she saw her mother deep in conversation with Mrs. Crank. Her heart dropped. Getting closer, she heard her mother say, It sounds like she was the only one not to panic. I can assure you we are not in a state of panic, protested Mrs. Crank, her pitch increasing with her levels of frustration. By all accounts, those insects looked poisonous, and we wanted to take appropriate precautions. Do you expect a 15-year-old girl to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the type of creatures that might infest a poorly maintained secondary school? Asked Lily's mum, folding her arms. You think that for protecting her class she should be punished, instead of admiring her for her fortitude? Mrs. Crank said, looking nervous. My employer gave me a strong recommendation for this school when we moved to the area, Mrs. Crank, and I don't want to regret following that advice, said Lily's mum, with a sharp tone before they noticed Lily watching them. Lily, have you finished with the letters Mrs. Crank asked you to write? I gave them to Mrs. Robinson. Then let's go. Lily followed her mother mutely, wishing she could talk to her with the kind of openness she was used to trusting her with. She was desperate to know if she knew that Geoffrey was magic, and if she had any magic herself but had just stopped using it. She wanted to ask her about everything in her life that had changed in the past 48 hours, and all the people who had given her reasons to be confused or scared. But instead she said, Thanks, Mum. So, any run-ins with Saffron today? Lily's mum asked as they drove out of the town towards the power station. Yeah, but we sort of made friends a bit later too, Lily said vaguely. She gazed out of the window. She realised that Saffron was one of the few things she could be honest with her mum about, and started talking rapidly. So I was talking to this boy she liked, Alex, and she saw us and got real bitchy about it. But then when I was in detention, right, she came in and she was dead upset because apparently her au pair keeps forgetting to pick her up and her parents won't do anything about it, and we chatted and stuff. It was nice. But now I don't know if she wants us to be friends. Well, how things have changed, she exclaimed. Lily blinked. Her mother's lack of understanding about how right she was just making her want to laugh out loud. So Saffron sounds like she's a very unhappy young lady and could use a friend. Want to tell me about this Alex? He's just a friend, Lily said, blushing. Her mum raised her eyebrows but said nothing. They pulled into the grounds of the power station, unloaded the car, and headed up the hill. Lily set up her easel and paints in front of the huge cooling towers, and her mum settled back on a camping chair with a book and a thermos of coffee. Squishing paints out, Lily allowed herself to relax. Painting was her safety, her calm. A space free from confusion. No animals to come alive and terrorise anybody. Just familiar and safe art. She breathed deeply and felt a calm wash over her that she hadn't felt since she first stepped out into school grounds. Soon the cooling towers were beautiful monoliths of lavender and mauve, turquoise and amaranth. The sky surrounding them glistened in cerulean and cornflower blue. Lily smiled. lightly dabbing white flicks across the evening sky as a flock of seagulls drifted by on a warm breeze. She was pleased with her work. It made her proud. "That's stunning, honey," said her mum behind her. But Lily was too busy panicking to appreciate the compliment. The white shapes, simple V's, were starting to quiver. Lily watched in horror as they got larger and larger, flying through the painted sky and straight at her face. She hasn't painted birds. They'd just been flicks of paint. How is this happening? She ducked as they launched themselves out of the canvas, feathers scattering everywhere as seagulls gushed from the paint and into reality. The canvas was knocked down and paint splattered across it as bird after bird gushed free from it. The gulls circled around, gabbing away in funny, squawky voices, and whizzed off merrily into the sky of a swirl of white. After watching them leave, Lily turned a worried face to her mother, who had witnessed the entire event. "Oh, darling, your painting is ruined. Those wretched birds." Lily wasn't sure how to react. Her mother wasn't mentioning the fact that a flock of seagulls had just flown straight out of the painting that was ruined. Was she not surprised? Did she know it would happen? "Did you see where they came from?" Lily asked. Her mum shook her head. "No, but there are lots of birds flying about. It was pure dumb luck that one crazy group decided to sabotage you." Lily frowned. Was her mother lying? Why would she do that? "Can we go home?" Lily asked, picking everything up. She needed to speak to Geoffrey. "I'll just do it again. It's fine. I have a pretty good memory." Her mum gave her a sympathetic hug, and they headed home in silence. "Geoffrey, my mum saw seagulls fly out of the painting, and she said nothing. Some weird girl told me I'm going to kill people. Alex is magic and says there's lots of people who are magic. What's happening? What's going on?" she asked, dropping her bags onto the carpet and rubbing her head, far too overwhelmed to think straight. "I'm so confused." The rabbit looked up from reading a copy of the Herald on the bed and said, "Who's Alex?" "He's just a boy from school. He's my friend," said Lily defensively, not sure why she was irritated by the question. "That's not even the point." "Why was he telling you about magic? Did you tell him about yours?" "No, he just knew," she said crossly. "Why does it matter? He said that loads of people have magic. Why didn't you tell me?" "This is a lot of questions, Lily," the rabbit sighed, scratching his left ear with his long back foot. "Please, Geoffrey," said Lily miserably. "You're the only person I can trust. There's nobody else I can talk to." "Okay, yes," he said honestly. "There are other people with magic, but that doesn't mean you should be using yours. Not until you have control, not until you understand it. Alex said people who don't use their powers don't deserve to keep them." "That is one school of thought," said Geoffrey slowly. "But personally, I believe that power can be dangerous if you're not careful with it, if you don't respect it. Why didn't my mum react when she saw the birds fly out? Maybe she didn't notice." "I guess," said Lily uncertainly, trying to remember whether her mum had been looking directly at the canvas or not. "Geoffrey, why does that girl think I'm going to kill people?" "I don't know," he said sadly. "Do you think you are?" "Unless I made a tiger come to life or something, I don't see how I could possibly kill people." "To understand what potential you have, we need to understand your magic," said Geoffrey assertively. "Until we do, make sure you only use it when absolutely necessary. And make sure you're always careful." "Yeah, okay," said Lily glumly. Not using her power wasn't the advice she'd wanted, but the idea she was dangerous frightened her. Deep in thought, she restarted her painting that had been ruined before. Geoffrey went back to his paper, muttering incoherently about the articles he was reading. Lily let her brain be still and put the craziness of the past 2 days out of her mind. But, in short, She didn't paint anything so much as a fly that could come alive. Karen Archer held the phone to her ear. "Has she used her power?" she asked into the receiver. "Excellent. Show her more. Make sure she understands reality. We can't lose her, she's too important. But if they get their claws into her, she could so easily be turned. She needs to trust us. She needs to understand her potential. She needs to use her power and see just how special she is for herself." That was chapter 3 of Lilly Prospero and the Magic Rabbit, my very first book. I will be back again next week to read chapter 4. Don't forget, if you go to my website, which is jjbarnes.co.uk, over there you'll find links to all my social media and all my books, including this one and the others I've written. There's also my writing advice blog, and I do a writing advice series on here to help encourage others. So thank you very much, and I'll be back again soon. Bye.